Ted Merz is an intentional investor, out now, Epsilon Theory YouTube. We talk about community and networking as two different things. We talked about poached eggs in Norway, eating them for the first time when he was a kid. This is lessons on immersion, how to be efficient versus how to be effective. We talk about the value and importance of explanations. He talks about being at Bloomberg and having the charts and realizing how you put the content in with them on top of them, because what we experience and see, explaining that will never go out of style. Jack Forehand, let's roll some clips.
We sat down for breakfast and they served me like a poached egg, in one of those little cup holders.
The little cup, yeah.
Yeah, the cup with the egg in it.
What did you do to it? Did you?
I don't know. I had never had a poached egg like that. I didn't know what it was. And so here's the thing. When you're in a situation like that, you look around at what other people are doing and you do what they do. But I was the only one with an egg. I've been thinking about the Omaha meeting since 1995. And I was, at some point in the 90s, the person who assigned the Bloomberg reporters to going. So I understood it was an important thing, right? I understood it was a big deal. But I never myself got on the plane and went until last year. I think the mistake people make oftentimes in their career, and I made, was prioritizing efficiency for effectiveness. I could show you a chart of anything. And in finance, we're all good at looking at charts. But then the value of explaining the chart with the framing, contextual understanding and explanation, it's a similar kind of thing. The origin of what Bloomberg was trying to do, adding news to charts to explain the why. You have the what, and you need to explain the why. It comes from a very fundamental place where people want to explain their point of view, and other people want to hear, how should I understand this thing I'm experiencing? That never gets tired. Like it never gets old. Like that, there's an endless need for that. I think there's a difference between community and networking. People are more generally trying to get connected and meet people with less of a ask or anything transactional, and more of an intentionality of like, let me meet and share what I'm working on, who I am and what I do. And maybe there's some intersection here. And those meetings oftentimes lead to engagements or business or friendships or something that you weren't ever pursuing. Networking is going after a very specific person and goal. And building community is much more like, I suspect that we've got some common ground here. So let's pursue that.
Welcome to The Intentional Investor with Matt Zeigler, where he and his guests explore the intersection of investing and life, portfolio and purpose. Nothing in this podcast is investment advice. Nothing in this podcast is advising you to buy or sell any security or to do anything with your money. Seriously, you should only act on investment advice from someone you know and who knows your unique situation. We are not that person. Matt Zeigler is a managing director at Sunpoint Investments, and the opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Sunpoint Investments or of Second Foundation Partners. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of Sunpoint Investments.
You're watching The Intentional Investor, brought to you by Epsilon Theory and the good people at Panoptica. Make sure you check out panoptica.ai. This is the show where I take one of the smartest, most strategic thinkers from my network, and we figure out what the world did to make them this way, but in a good, fun, and conversational way. So who's with me? What if you threw baseball legend Ted Williams, media mogul Ted Turner, and fictional coach bad pun enthusiast Ted Lasso into a blender? You get this guest because he can divide a LinkedIn post into at least 77 baseball-sized cells and figure out what's likely to get 4 views versus 400 or maybe even 40,000. And maybe it's less important than inventing CNN or 24-hour news, but he did help oversee getting Twitter integrated into the Bloomberg terminal, and that changed the way a whole class of decision makers operated and talked to each other online in this modern era. And sure, he's technically a little short on Midwestern charm perhaps, but he makes up for that in Jersey Shore-themed appreciation for his dad, and he especially fits the bill of understanding why first you have to get the culture right, and only after do you get a shot at having some wins. Any other way of ordering it is utterly insane. Enough salading of words, from starting at Bloomberg as a startup to exiting it in the most pandemic-y way possible, only to reinvent himself over and over online for all of us to see. I wish this was over a New York breakfast. Ted Merz. Welcome to The Intentional Investor.
Thanks for having me, Matt. That's quite an introduction.
I mean, you got a little of those Teds in you, right? A little Ted Williams in you somewhere. Appreciation if nothing
Ted
else.
Williams, last hitter to hit 400, right?
It's a remarkable thing. What about Ted Turner? You got a little Ted Turner in there somewhere?
It's funny. I just bought Ted Turner's biography,
Oh, it's
which is, I think, out of print. You have to buy it on eBay, and you can't. It's no longer in print, but it's fantastic. And I bought it for one specific reason. I'll tell you, which is that in the book he reprints a letter from his father to him while he's at Brown, and the letter's like, "I'm incredibly disappointed in you." So I bought it because I wanted to get a copy of that letter, and that's the only place it is. So
it's a fantastic reason to go out and search for it. That's a book that I found in a library, and then somebody stole it from the library. Like, it was
Oh, no.
I always hate when that happens.
okay, well, it's on my list to read right now. So
Okay, well, hopefully share a picture of the letter, the disapproving letter from his dad. I really want to make sure that exists on the internet if it's not easy to come across in a book. And what about Ted Lasso? Did you do any Ted Lasso?
Ted Lasso,
Your
I
thing?
only watch him on Reels. So I actually have never seen the whole show, but I've seen a lot of clips. So I get the idea.
The culture first and differentiating mentality, I think, will rhyme. I want to throw us in to this part of your life first, and then we're going to go all the way back after that.
Okay.
I'm really curious. So it's 2022 that you get let go at Bloomberg?
Yes.
We're at the beginning of 2026 recording this. You today, looking back on that moment versus you in that moment when you get that email or you get told, like, "Hey buddy, sorry, we no longer need your services." How do you contextualize it now versus then?
There've been there are a lot of life lessons. And I think that, the way I contextualize it, the biggest 2 points I'd say is that I had worked for a company for 3 decades. And so I had continued, I expected to continue to working there. And when they let you go, it's a bit of a shock, to your identity and to what you expected to do. And I realized you have to, one, reinvent yourself. But I think the biggest 2 lessons I learned coming out of that were that, one, I had to be more visible for my own self and what I do. And that's what led to a lot of the writing online and now doing videos online. You can't rely on a company to tell people what you've done and who you are. You have to write your own story. And this goes for everybody, whether you're a writer or not. You have to find a way to tell your own story. And the second aspect I think I learned was the value of community as opposed to, let's say, networking. I thought I had a big network, but the network was really all within one company where I worked. And when I left that place, I realized I really didn't have a network of people who would help me find the new opportunities. So I had to create that. There was a whole way of going about that I think a lot of other people now are going through. And perhaps contextualizing it, obviously a lot of people get laid off in their jobs and work. And I think that I was on the early end of what we now see as a trend, where even very successful companies and successful people are laid off at some point. And I think that is a bit different. So if I were to contextualize why I think this is interesting, is that, you go back 20, 30 years, you were laid off at a company that was struggling, or you were laid off if you were struggling and not doing well. But since the pandemic, we've seen the best companies oftentimes lay off some of their top performers because they're just kind of cutting across divisions or something. And so those people, I was one of those people, very unprepared at the time for how to handle that.
I know this is going to come up, that reinvention thread, over and over. I just have no doubts about this in this conversation. But take me all the way back. Where are you originally born and raised? Where in the world?
I grew up in New Jersey.
Where in New Jersey? Shout out the town.
Small town named Madison. It is home to Drew University. It's about 45 minutes to an hour outside New York City. And it was kind of a standard commuter train town. Men would get on the train. When I was growing up, men would get on the train, go to work, come home, And it was very kind of idyllic, traditional place.
Mom and dad, what are they doing? How'd they end up in Madison?
My father worked for the power company, the utility company, and they picked Madison for the school's quality of life. They wanted a place where you could walk to downtown. They wanted a place where, the schools were excellent, and so it turned out his employer was pretty close by, so that's how they ended up there.
Did mom work or was she staying home?
My mom was principally worked in the home, but she also did have a small business doing wallpaper, and she taught a nursery school, and she did a fair amount of things outside too.
Was there like an entrepreneurial awareness aspect of her doing these little kind of like side hustles and curiosities, or was it
I don't
too
think so.
casual?
Opportunities came up, and she just was interested. Things she was interested in. I would say. One of the things for me personally, I think I don't come from an entrepreneurial background at all, and I was never that way when I was working in corporate either. I saw myself as working in a company, and as my father did, and his father, and so forth. So I didn't really identify particularly with entrepreneurial aspects, and that's an interesting change, because that for me now I see like new business opportunities every day. I'm constantly like, I should start this business or that business. I do think, let me jump ahead for one thought, is I think the world has changed, and I'm a big believer that we've made this transition from kind of an institutional to an individual world, where the institutions would take care of you, so you'd try to work for a great institution. And now there's much more of a sense, particularly in the younger generations, that you have a side hustle, you've got something going on, you find a way to make money yourself. And that I have absorbed, deeply. And I think that that's a really big change in the world, as well as a lot of people I know.
And maybe this is jumping too far forward in it too, but like your dad didn't have that. That wasn't his reality either.
No.
None of these things existed.
Yeah. My father was a manager at the power company. And, when he left work and he came home and he coached my baseball team and my soccer team, and he was active in the community. So that was a more traditional to that time kind of role, where your work was left at the office, and you came home and you did other things, and so totally different.
And did community stuff, which is I don't know. It's an interesting angle. It's an interesting angle to put back in there.
Yeah.
What any siblings, or is it just you?
I have a brother and a sister. My brother is 2 years younger. He lives in Seattle. He's a graphic designer. My sister is 7 years younger, and she's a librarian outside of Washington.
All right. So oldest child, Ted. What are you into as a kid? You said sports. What else?
I was big into sports. We started playing. It's interesting. My father wanted us to play sports, and we wanted to play sports. I think the interesting thing there is that he looked ahead, and my father's a very strategic planner and thinker, and he's an engineer by occupation. He did not want us to play football because he thought even then he was worried about the injuries. And like he looked up and there's this new sport emerging called soccer. This is in the 70s, right? And so he helped organize a rec league in town so that I could be on that team. That was pretty amazing. Like he got that going, and he was initially a coach, and later on he became a referee, and he refereed high school games, which was both a great way to stay in shape and great way to participate in the community and so forth. But he got into soccer mainly to find a sport for his kids so he could play something and not get injured. Pretty wild.
Any like awareness of like he just knew it was a quote unquote up and coming sport in America?
No, not really. Somehow he heard about it or looked it up or read about it. The awareness about soccer was starting to grow.
Sure.
But we did not have I was the first year, I joined the rec league the first year it existed. So.
And a league. It's not like he just started a team. Like he got enough people together.
Right. We had a team where we played a bunch, we played people in town. And yeah, so I mean, that was just, he bought the books, he read up the manuals, he figured out what the rules are, and it's all totally foreign. He had never really watched or played soccer himself, so interesting. Yeah.
Were you good? Were you good? What's
You
your
know,
athletic
I
ability?
was
Rank
like-
yourself.
I'm going to rank myself. So I was, on the top teams, the traveling teams, but I was not a starter. So the team I was on won the state championship, which is pretty amazing, but I wasn't on the starter. I was mostly on the bench. But so I was good, but not great, I guess, is what you'd say.
Did as a kid, that good but not great thing, this is something I'm fascinated by, and I think people in sports catch this usually before most other people do. Like, this is a great young adult teenager experience where you realize why you're not a starter. You recognize the gap. Did you have an awareness of the gap, or were you like,
Yeah, I wasn't, I mean, I I didn't think, oh, I should be starting. I was not as good as some of the other players. And I'd say I was varsity soccer, varsity tennis, but not the top in either sport. And I knew that. And I can't really remember how I thought about that, but it didn't particularly bother me. I wasn't consumed by that or thought it was wrong. I don't think the coach made the wrong decision. Let's put it that way. I was good, and I was happy to play. I was happy to be part of the team, happy to contribute. But it didn't particularly bother me.
nothing wrong with getting a state championship on the bench too? That's got to be a
No,
pretty cool
it was
feeling.
great. That was great. Super proud of that. So,
Do you remember what school you beat, or what town you beat, or what team?
oof, no, I do not. I don't. No, I'd have to go back and look.
It's okay. It's an interesting. It's a funny little thing. What else are you into? Like, are you into reading? Are you into literature? Are you into history?
Yeah, I
Any
was in
school
high-
subjects?
In high school, I was a very big reader. I like to read history. I like to read philosophy. I like to read literature. And those were all somewhat outliers, I would say, at the time.
So how's that happening? Who's nudging you or encouraging this interest?
I don't know, really. I don't think anybody, I mean, there wasn't any particular group. That's what I gravitate to. I liked reading. I liked reading things that most people were not reading, I'd say.
Give me some
I
examples.
spent a lot of time in the library, spent a lot of time. Also, I lived in the suburbs. I spent a lot of time going into New York City on the weekends. And that was kind of an outlier at the time. The world's, I think, very different than it was. Probably the biggest way it demonstrated itself was when I graduated high school. Unlike pretty much everybody else in my class, I didn't go right to college. I chose to do a year abroad as an exchange student, and I lived in Norway for a year. Went to high school in Norway, and I think that's a kind of thing, like, now that seems like a pretty normal and not a crazy thing to do. At the time, it was pretty unusual, and people were like, why would you not want to go right to college? What are you thinking? They didn't really see the value of that. I did, because I thought it was really interesting to learn another culture. I learned Norwegian, went to school, met a whole bunch of friends. And I think, but that was in the early 80s. That was still fairly unusual. We didn't really have the kind of semester abroad or travel mentality that people have now. And people forget how it was like very, you didn't meet Americans who traveled all over the place at that point. It was fairly unusual still.
So how, like, the end of high school, how does this, why is Norway on your list, number one? And then B, how's this even happen?
Well, I applied the program. It's called AFS, American Field Service, and their principal goal is to place exchange students in different places.
How did you find out about them, though? To, like, sign in the
That's a good
library?
question. Yeah, that's a good question. I think maybe I knew somebody who had gone on it, or I saw a sign or something. I really don't remember, but I signed up, I applied. One of the aspects of the program is you can't pick where you're going. So the idea is you have to be open to experience. You can't say, oh, I only want to go to France or Germany or whatever. So you end up, and I remember them saying, if you have an absolute no, you can put that down. I remember they said, for example, if you fish, you might not want to go to Norway. And I don't love fish, okay? But I was like, I want to be open. I didn't say that. I ended up going to Norway. So it was a great experience. And, I lived outside Bergen, which is the second largest city in the country. However, lived on a small island and went to, basically high school. So the high school is a little bit different. It's 3 years instead of 4, and it's 1 year older. So I was at the same age as my classmates. And again, the world's a little bit different where, when you travel now, like everybody speaks English, but that was not the case in the early 80s. And so I went into a place where I basically didn't then speak English for a year. I just spoke Norwegian. And so you walk in not knowing any of the language. You just have to like listen and learn and study. And that was, I think, felt like that was a really a great accomplishment for me to learn the language and to meet friends and sort of get acclimated and so forth. And it's a really cool society and really interesting. So
you're 18 when you do this?
Yeah.
And mom and dad I want to hear more about this island that you lived on in a second, but mom and dad were just like, cool, Ted, like this is a perfectly acceptable path for you to go on, or?
Yeah, they seemed to think it was fine. Well, they were always very supportive. I wouldn't say they would have ever thought of that, but they were very supportive, and they were, if that's what you want to do, that sounds fantastic, and so great. And that's a thing I think that about my parents I really appreciate is how, they would maybe make it clear what they thought, or they have ideas or suggestions, but if you wanted to do something, they would support you in whatever that was.
Tell me a little bit about, do you remember whether it's getting off the plane, getting off the boat, whatever the situation was, when did the immersion hit you? Well, that had to be a crazy experience.
Yeah, no, the immersion hit me when, so you land and then they take you to the house, the family you're going to live with. So you walk into this family. There were 3 children, a mother and father, and they're just talking at you like you don't understand anything they're saying, not a word, right? But contextually, you understand. Like they show you, here's the bathroom, here's a towel. We're sitting down to dinner. We had dinner, and there were 2 things that hit me. The first was we sat down. I guess it might have been breakfast. We sat down for breakfast, and they served me like a poached egg, in one of those little cup holders.
The little cup, yeah.
Yeah, the cup with the egg in it.
What did you do to it? Did you?
I don't know. I had never had a poached egg like that. I didn't know what it was. And so here's the thing. When you're in a situation like that, you look around at what other people are doing and you do what they do. But I was the only one with an egg. No one else got an egg. And so I didn't know what to do with it. And I found out much later, and this is hilarious, that they had their egg. They only had egg like once a week, or poached egg once a week, and they had it yesterday. So they felt they wanted to give it to me today, even though they didn't want me to wait a week. But that's why they weren't eating egg. But as a result, I couldn't emulate what they were doing. So I was like, what do I do with this egg? And so there were just things like that were really funny. Easy explanations, but if you don't speak the language, obviously no explanation. You just kind of power through it.
Did you know you would be good in that format, or that you'd figure it out? Or was it just like, how much of a draw was that immersion aspect versus the reality of being immersed?
No, I think I wanted to get into the world and just like I wanted to get out of New Jersey and experience the world. And I knew the world was a big place. I wasn't trying to, once you get there though, you're like, wow, this is like hard.
Yeah.
It's hard and lonely and like you can't speak to anybody. And so I don't think I was like dying to do that. Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't, I want to be immersed in some place where, hardcore learn the language. You don't really think about that. At least at that age, I didn't think about it. I just wanted to get out of the town I was in and see something new. So it's funny, but then, you go through, typically in those experiences, you go through a lull where you're pretty depressed by Christmas. And as you start to come out the other side, the weather gets a little better. Norway, by the way, is it's all dark in the winter, dark, and it rains every day. At least where I was. So it's
you're way up there. It's one of those things, or yeah, you got
Yeah.
the really, really short days.
Yeah. So that's funny.
Okay, so you do a full year of this?
I
Of
do
this
a full
program?
year. I think the most interesting thing is you go to school like you were a normal student. They don't really make any accommodations for you. And I took language classes. So I took Norwegian, German, English, but you take everything, math, whatever. It's, you're trying to learn things in a language you don't speak. So that's crazy.
Yeah,
But
completely
yeah,
insane to not only be learning a concept you wouldn't understand or
but I
have a
think,
hard time with in English.
yeah,
But
I
then,
mean, I think nobody's under the illusion you're really there to get a high grade in the class because you're not going to get a high grade. But you do everything a normal student would do. You sit in class, you take the tests, you write the essays. I can't imagine what they thought of my essays, that horrible. Keep in mind, we didn't have computers and we didn't have the internet and AI.
well, this is all
So
right.
it wasn't like you could write something and say, translate this into Norwegian and give it to them. Right. So it's I think the other thing to think about when you think about that experience, I think for me is interesting is that a lot of the experiences I had are not things that could ever happen again. And specifically, it was really expensive to make a phone call. So I spoke to my parents, I think only twice. I spoke at Christmas and Easter, and that was it. So you were in a place where we did write letters, and the letters would take, 10 days to go back and forth. But that world obviously doesn't exist anymore. You're just on Zoom or video, calling. It's interesting. Like that generation, I'm kind of like that. Our generation had an experience that is really hard to even get your head around anymore. That sort of is somewhat of a separation or isolation. So you would write letters, and then twice during the year I called them. That was it. That's the only contact you had.
What brings that? You do your year, and then it's like, hey, it was nice to see you, Ted. Like back to the States, or how's a program like that end?
It just ends. I mean, like you're at the end of 12 months, you pack up, you say goodbye, you leave, you go home, and pick up your life. But it's interesting. I think it's I'm a big fan of technology and communication. That's my whole career. And yet it's interesting to look back at that time and realize that there were a lot of limitations. I think I wrote a lot of letters while I was there to people, and many of them I got back, like people gave me them back or my parents kept them. And you think back about forms of communication, letter writing is like you have to have this whole idea, and you're putting it all together in a package to send to somebody, and they absorb it at one moment. And our communication now is so much more, I don't know if it's like these back and forth texting, like it's a little thing, back and bang, 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 you almost never sit down and write a full cohesive, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I'm doing. Maybe some people do that, but it's really, I feel like, evaporated. I think that's the letter thing is interesting. I don't know if you had that experience, but I kept, or most of and I made copies of most of the letters I sent, so I have those. I have a huge box of letters I sent and received in the 80s and 90s. And at one point they're handwritten in the 80s. And in the 90s they're typed on a computer, typed on a typewriter in the beginning of the 90s, and then typed on a computer in the end of the 90s. And then after like 2006, they just stop. And it becomes all email, and our communication shifts. I'm like very interested in how the form of communication also changes the message and the information you're communicating.
It's kind of the ultimate Marshall McLuhan thing, right? Of like the medium and the message.
They're tied together, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, if you're communicating in a letter, it's more akin to writing an essay or writing a blog post or something versus communicating the way we're now doing with email and so forth. So it changes the temporalness and the informality of it. I think that's very interesting. That has, we'll look back at this time period and think, wow, that's when language changed a lot. And I don't think we're really cognizant of that as it's happening.
We're not quite there yet. It's also interesting because the audience too, like when you're writing a letter to presumably your parents or maybe some friends or whatever else, you're very cohesive about here's how much paper roughly I'm using for this letter. Here's the information I want to get across. And like, this is why they care about it as my intended audience.
Well, yeah, many of the letters, people will not remember this unless you're a certain age, but there was this thing called airmail paper, which was like super light. It was like incredibly
Really
thin.
Yeah.
And so all my letters were on airmail paper because it weighed less because you paid so much for the postage. So it changes you. And of course, a letter is one-to-one, normally, one person to one person. Blog writing or posting online is one-to-many, so completely different feel to that.
You come back home, you going straight to work, you going back to college, or what?
I went to college.
What happens?
Yeah, I went to St. John's College, which is a small liberal arts school that has two campuses, one in Annapolis and one in Santa Fe. And it is known for its great books program. So this was probably the second decision my parents scratched their head at, because I wanted to go to this school that read Plato and Aristotle, like had no practical purpose whatsoever.
Did you decide this before you came back?
I decided before. So it was I think it was a similar vein. I was a big reader and interested in philosophy and literature. But so St. John's is well known among people who know. It only has 400 kids at each campus, really small. But the Annapolis campus is right across the street from the Naval Academy, and it's actually was founded as the King William School in the late 1600s. So technically, it's like the third oldest campus in America. It's really like a beautiful setting, and it attracts a certain type of student who's wants to read and talk about issues. And the idea there is that the education you get is one of critical thinking. So you read Aristotle and then you argue about it in oral seminars. And the thinking is that, okay, the world changes so fast. What you really need to learn is how to think and how to think critically. And that's the premise of it. But again, my father, who's an engineer, must have thought that's insane. Like that. And going back, by the way, to Ted Turner, that was Ted Turner's father's complaint about Brown. Ted Turner decided to study classics at Brown, and his father said that was like the worst choice ever. But anyway, I went to St. John's in Annapolis for 2 years and Santa Fe for 2 years. So I split my time at either campus. And, I think I enjoyed the time. It was a good education. And ironically, I think it got me my first job because the person hiring me was interested in philosophy and interested in. So when they saw this, they're like, oh, they wanted to talk about that. It was a differentiator. It's not like everybody's a STEM student or everybody this. It was a bit different, but that's certainly not what I was thinking when I went. When I went, I just had no idea what I was doing. So,
what was the friend group like when you're in that type of collegiate setting?
Well, St. John's is like a particularly unusual place. Again, I think it's self-selective in who it attracts. Everybody was like super individualistic is the way I would remember it. Like, and everybody had some kind of a tick in their personality that was kind of memorable. But I think it's very small school, very small footprint, and the characteristic mostly is that people like talking about ideas. So you could get any of the students together and they would talk about practically anything, but particularly about the work at school, but they would talk about anything. And so very verbal, but good friends, and it was a good place to spend some time. One thing you didn't ask me yet, but so it's a 4-year program, but after the third year, I quit to take a year off. And so that probably terrified my parents too. Like, you want to get through, like, because you think, now I know I have kids and I know just get through college. If you get through college, like, that's
Figure
good.
some stuff out there.
You'll figure some things out
After.
and like you'll have a degree. And so when I quit after my third year, and I'm sure they were thinking like,
And you quit or you paused?
well, I paused. I said, I took a year off.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I'm just saying that now, as a parent with college age
Sure.
students, I would not want them to pause.
Right. Just
And then my
finish,
job is done, right? So
finish this up.
right. So
Okay. So wait,
paused.
how's number one? Does the pause occur between the Annapolis and Santa Fe phase? Have you already been to both
No,
campuses?
I went to Annapolis, then I went to Santa Fe. I did a second year in Santa Fe. And after my junior year, I paused, and then I returned to Annapolis for my senior year.
All right. What do you do on the pause?
I went to Spain and
Okay.
lived in Granada and kind of learned Spanish.
Kind of learn Spanish. Were
I know
you
I
trying?
did. I learned Spanish very well, but
were
I
you
didn't
trying
do
to
anything.
Was this
Not
trying to
anything
recreate?
formal.
Okay. Is this like Norway all over again? You're like, I did that once. I want to do this again in a different place.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I was like, I did Norway and I learned Norwegian and it was great. And I learned a culture and I want to do that again. The difference is I didn't do it with the family. I just, so I spend most of the time in bars or cafes. Like, you get up, you get a cafe and read the newspaper and talk to people and so forth. So
Totally solo for that trip too? Where you're just like,
no, so I went with my girlfriend
okay.
who had a scholarship to study there. But I myself kind of just rode shotgun. Like I didn't set up anything. It was like truly just like a sabbatical, I didn't have anything on the plate. So it was great. I mean, like I think
How
I
could
don't
it
know.
not be great? I mean,
It was great. Like in hindsight, I think that when I think of young people today, they seem to be more directed and driven. They like, if they did that, if they went to Spain, they would line up some kind of internship or line up some kind of program or do whatever. And I'm not saying what I did it the right way. I guess keep in mind that the world was different. There weren't really the same level of internships, connections, work experiences, volunteer opportunities, and whatever. So I just went and I lived there and I had a great time. Did a lot of writing. Really the focus was like learning Spanish. And Spanish became a very key part of my career professionally. So I didn't do that for that reason, but that's what happened ultimately. So
yeah, that's funny.
Yeah.
The experiences we pick up start to stack in
I
unique
think,
ways.
yeah, looking back, I think it's, Steve Jobs has that famous line in his speech at Stanford where looking back, you can connect the dots.
Yeah, exactly.
And I often think one of the things when a lot of people these days talk about how you organize your life and how you do this. And there's nothing wrong with thinking like that, but I think most people actually just kind of do somewhat random things that then set down rails where their life takes them. And, Jobs was, he talks about how he studied calligraphy. He obviously did not study calligraphy with the intent of founding Apple and including fonts in the design, but it became a key aspect of his career in life. So I think it's a little like that where I just gravitated in this direction and then that became a big part of my life later. So
It's always so fascinating to me with that. It's if you let your attention hoover up all those different spots and you're like, no, I really care about that. Then calligraphy has the chance to show up later because you already love
Yeah.
it. And that just
Yeah.
makes it a point of differentiation down the road. You don't have to know how you're going to use it. You just have to be like, oh, wow, this is a really cool thing to pick up and hang on to.
it's very interesting in life, but I think if you're learning skills and meeting people and learning new experiences, I think it's always good. And it's hard to predict how you'll use those later.
Yeah. And nor should you try to force prediction upon them, which I think is
Yeah,
another
like-
easy thing to do.
Like in my case, I think probably my experience in Norway shaped me, but Norway did not become a big part of my life
Right.
And in fact, I really didn't go back for 40 years. Learning Spanish, however, completely changed the trajectory, so that that turned out to be a big thing.
So how does the girlfriend's semester or semesters abroad just end and now you come back, or
Yeah,
how does that play out?
we spent the year there, and then I came back and I went back to school, and I went back to school in Annapolis and finished St. John's, and probably looking back, the most significant thing that happened there as a signaler was that I started writing for the newspaper. They had a very tiny printed newspaper at St. John's. And I wrote this article, I guess it was once a week. And the article was, I went to the library and I read the newspapers from the week, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post. And I distilled down and summarized the major events into blurbs that we put in this this newspaper. And I guess one of the things that's interesting about this is like that literally is what I've done for the rest of my career, is kind of like read the news and summarize the news in various formats, literally. So I guess that you could say I don't know why I did that. No one asked me to do that. I just volunteered. I said, my thought was that when I talked to my fellow students, none of them had any idea of what was going on in the world. And it's an interesting fact, again, that world does not exist anymore. So like pretty much everybody you meet today is aware of what's going on generally in politics, the economy, markets, and the world. And in a way that college students in the 1980s were not. There was obviously there's no internet, but there was no iPhone, there was no accessibility, there's no social media. I mean, I think, there were some major events during that time, and like they'd be completely unaware of that, and entirely unaware.
Right, so it's pure, like
no awareness. So anyway, I thought there was a need to keep people generally informed, so that's it. I read the newspapers for them, and I summarized them, and I put it in this newspaper. And I don't know why I did that, but that's obviously like the harbinger of what was to come.
So did you already have the awareness of, and maybe it's just because you liked reading, or maybe it was because of the hanging out in Spanish cafes, what got you in the habit of even caring about the rest of the world or being curious about the rest of the world? Where'd that interest come from?
I mean, I think the interest in the world came in part from being in Norway, being in Spain, and just being curious.
Okay.
Yeah, I've always been curious about things. So the curiosity and travel were probably the drivers. And I think the last drivers, for whatever reason, I liked to inform people about things that were going on. That's a bit of more of a mystery. But I like to be the one who told you we went to war in Iraq or something, and then people be like, oh, I didn't know that. It just is kind of a rush, right? So telling...
A little dopamine hit, yeah.
There's a dopamine hit just hearing something's going on and then telling other people about it. And that exists like to this day. So, like literally this morning, you read something and you're like, oh, I want to tell other people about this. And now we have the mechanism through the internet and social media. You can just do that. Back in the day, I was like, how am I going to do this? There was a newspaper. So I kind of hijacked a page in the newspaper. Yeah. Weird.
What do you graduate with? Like, what's the official, what's on the degree?
With a degree in philosophy and a minor in math.
Okay.
Which I'm like the least mathematical person ever. So I like to tout out that I have a minor in math.
That's great. And it was the idea like logical proofs and stuff like that? Or was it
so like
math?
The math program at St. John's, you would read Euclid. Okay. Like the original, obviously translated from the Greek, but you'd read the original text and then you would try to redo their proofs. Mm-hmm. So it's insane to in any sense claim you have a degree in math based on that. And likewise in philosophy. So philosophy is a little bit more defendable, but the St. John's program is you read the original texts and then argue over them. You don't really do. You're not studying philosophy in the way anybody else at any other school would do it. So yeah, armed with the philosophy degree, you're not really ready for the world, or have really any idea of where to go or what to do with that.
So where'd you go and what'd you do with that?
I had a friend who, so by senior year, at some point, I had visited a friend of mine in Mexico City, and he was working at an English language newspaper called the Mexico City News. And when I went to see him, his job looked like the most fun thing you could ever do in your life. So I basically shadowed him for a day or two, and you're in this office and you run out and you go to like a press conference, and there's a press conference and somebody says something, and then you run back into the office and you type it up, and then you run down and work with the people who edit it. It was like frenetic activity. It was incredibly loud, and it was you're out on the street and in real life all the time. You're meeting new people every day. Every day you have a new topic that you have to figure out and write about. And I thought that sounded like the most like fun thing ever. And I had contrasted that because I had spent my summers interning in a law firm, which I liked the people a lot, and I could see the benefits of it. But we were in kind of a windowless room, summarizing briefs, and it was really, really. I was like, wow, you're going to sit in this room for 50 years. It didn't seem like interesting at all. So when I saw this guy's job, I said, that sounds amazing. I want to do that. So when school ended, I wrote a letter to the editor of the newspaper and asked if I could come and apply for a job. And he wrote back and said, sure. And I got down there and they had one job, and it was the job nobody wanted. Okay, so I arrived in Mexico in the summer, the fall of 89. Fall of 89. And the jobs at that point everybody wanted were covering politics, covering sports, and covering culture. That's what people wanted to write about. And the job that nobody wanted was writing about business. So that was the only available job. Like, you write about business, and you would go to these events and listen to businessmen speak, and write pieces about it.
Are you writing in English?
That's what I took. You wrote in. I reported in Spanish and wrote in English. Yes, it was an English language publication. It was aimed at expatriates and the kind of diplomatic community and so forth.
Why was business boring in the late 80s in Mexico City? Why did nobody want that beat?
Well, business was boring everywhere in the 70s and 80s for some reason. Okay. Why did nobody? I think, people gravitate to what's interesting and what society thinks is like elevated or happening. So there was a TV show in the late 80s, LA Law. And when that came out, everybody wanted to be a lawyer. Right? The movie Wall Street comes out and everybody wants to go to Wall Street. I mean, like, Social Network comes out and everybody wants to be Mark Zuckerberg. I think so. Society goes in these trends, and it was just not fashionable. It wasn't what people, it could have even been a little bit of a hangover from Watergate. The Woodward and Bernstein and political reporting was super exciting, but business was viewed as very, very stodgy and not interesting whatsoever. And that wasn't just in Mexico. That was kind of everywhere. And I realized that because when I came back to the U.S., there were not very many business reporters in the early 90s in the U.S. But anyway, I got the job and I worked and I made like $80 a week. And I worked in this newsroom, and I went out and covered things. But what happened was, and the significant thing that happened was that the government of Carlos Salinas de Gortari was a technocratic group of people who were focused on transforming the economy. So what they were doing were privatizing institutions like the steel companies and the banks. They were in the process of signing the North American Free Trade Agreement to open trade. And they were liberalizing lots of other price fixes and different things. So I think the privatization, the trade, the opening of trade, and they were encouraging more investment, foreign investment. And so there was a sudden explosion of interest from companies wanting to invest in Mexico. And, this somewhat dovetailed with, in the early 90s, the growth of the equity markets in the U.S. and the explosion of the stock market and so forth. So there was a lot of money and a lot of hustle, and people started to gravitate to that. And then they wanted more information on it. And that's kind of the genesis of how, it's not like there hadn't been business reporting, but that's when it got significantly bigger,
When you're suddenly privatizing or you're changing partnership structures to public structures, this all of a sudden there's a lot of money moving around these ideas, whether or not it's generally realized.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So I had incredible opportunities as a reporter there. I covered the president a number of times. I covered the signing of the NAFTA agreement. I covered the debt renegotiation deal, which was done with the president, Gortari, and then John Reed from Citibank was there, and a bunch of other major bankers. So being in the audience to watch that happen was really a cool historical moment. And I didn't fully understand how dramatic it was even for the world, but ultimately became so. It was a playbook that was then followed by countries everywhere.
What's the connection? How's that job come to a close? What happens?
Yeah, so,
how's it progress?
So I worked there for a year, and then I moved back to the States, got married, and my wife started in medical school in New York City. And so I was moving to New York City. And so I started looking for work in New York, and it was I don't know if it was officially a recession, but felt like a recession at that time. A lot of closed businesses. New York was in a slump.
And say what year this was again?
1990.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine who worked at the Wall Street Journal said that a colleague named Matt Winkler had left to start a new news organization called Bloomberg. And he didn't know any more than that. But I called Matt. He gave me Matt's number, and I called Matt, and Matt said, come in and visit him. And I got there, and the first thing Matt was mostly interested in was my education, studying the great books, and that's kind of mostly what we talked about. So,
did he know about the program, or was it just
he knew all about the
Wait a
program.
second.
He knew all about the program, and he was really interested in it. And this is one of the things why I say that when people are looking for jobs, it's like, yes, you can be selling the thing you do, but people are also interested in who you are and what you've done and something that differentiates you, particularly in a world where you're going to be doing different jobs your whole career. Anyway, he was interested in that. He gave me a writing test, and the test was like, what is the most significant business story in America, or in the world? And my essay was about how it was the signing of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was probably so wonky and so crazy that he was like he loved that.
So I love this guy because he picked.
It was not, believe it or not, it was not the end of the Soviet Union. It was it could have been a million other things. But
Right.
I argued it was the dismantling of tariffs. And so he loved that. And I remember I was in the interview with him. I did the test, and I walked home. And when I got home, there's a voicemail on the answering machine, saying that, you're hired. So that was a relief to get a job. I was the 15th person to start in Bloomberg News. So Bloomberg News started in 1990, and I joined in November, towards the end of the year. And so it was a pretty small group of people, and, had no idea where that was going or what really. what it was, but had an interesting, yeah. So I was, I think, 25 at the time. And, got to see this go from what would be called today a startup, into something massive. But, it was success. It was, Mike had started selling Bloombergs in 83. So it was established, we had offices, a fair number of people, a lot of clients, but it was nothing like it was today, of course.
Was there a sense, and I think this is important, you said today it would be called a startup.
Yeah.
Then it was not. It was a weird,
Yeah.
It was just a weird thing that I can't imagine you had a lot of other friends, certainly not your wife, certainly not other people in your life who were like, oh yeah, at my 15-person scrappy company.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I say that is because the way startups are viewed today,
Yeah.
startups have a fairly favorable perception.
Celebrated. It's cool.
Celebrated. At that time, the company like Bloomberg, so one of the reasons I was hired was because Matt could not hire like real journalists.
Yeah.
People with any level of experience were not going to work there. It would have been deemed way too risky, insane to leave a platform like the New York Times or Wall Street Journal.
Because how are you ever going to get back?
How are you
Whereas
going to
you're
get back?
coming out
You're
of
already
the
at the
Mexico
top of
City
the
paper.
mountain,
Exactly.
And you have no sense that this thing's going to go anywhere. So the people, those initial 15 people, a large percentage were people changing career who had been in the markets. And this is kind of an interesting aspect about Bloomberg, was that the sort of original DNA of Bloomberg News was not journalists, actually. A lot of them were people who, let's say, had traded muni bonds or mortgage bonds or government bonds or oil. And they, for whatever reason, were switching careers and had an aspiration to do writing. And so they were deeply knowledgeable about the topic,
Yeah.
And then
That's
Matt's
really
idea
cool.
Matt was like, okay, I'll teach them how to write. Matt's idea at the time was it's easier to teach them how to write than it is to teach a writer about oil. Obviously, that wasn't everybody. Some people were hired with some journalism background, but the other folks had fairly limited. I'd say fairly limited. And so that is not the way it is today, but that's how it started. And I think that's part of the reason why Bloomberg always started from this feeling of being very focused on actual markets and finance and business in a deeper way than its competitors. And I think that helped it.
Now, it doesn't take long, and I might have dates off on this, but it doesn't take long before are you covering Latin America again? Are you back on that beat?
It was about a year and change. So ironically, my first job was to summarize newspapers, just like I had done at college. And so
Did they know you had done it in college, or they were just like, we have a new role a new task for you?
No, I don't think they knew that. That's not why I got that job. I mean, they needed somebody. There were 3 people, and they needed someone to read the newspapers and summarize what happened, and then write up little blurbs about like the New York Times reported this or the Wall Street Journal reported this. And interestingly, at the time, newspapers were loath to admit someone else had reported something.
Right.
So it was not standard practice to the degree it is today to acknowledge someone else wrote a story. Okay. If the Times broke a story, the Journal would try to re-report it the next day.
Like it was theirs. Right.
Like it was theirs.
Because there was that weird status scarcity thing going on with.
They're like, well, we're going to tell it for our customers.
Right.
I think what's changed is that there was this belief that like our customer, they don't know any, our customers aren't.
There's a wall.
Seeing anything else. There's a wall.
Our audience, your audience.
But it's also a little bit dishonest too.
It's a lot of bit dishonest.
So the media has gotten better about acknowledging where information comes from. And I'd say it's more standard practice today that if you're getting it from somewhere, you acknowledge the data of who reported it first. In any event, Bloomberg did do that. They summarized items saying explicitly, this is from the New York Times and so forth. But the other idea there is that you were trying to get the information quickly to people. And I think the most interesting thing that's memorable about that whole experience is that the idea came up that, newspapers are basically published and are available at 4 a.m. at wholesalers. And they hit the newsstand at 6. And so the idea came up that, and ultimately I went and I would buy them from the wholesaler, like under the table. I'd give them a $5 bill for like $2 of newspapers or whatever. And they would slip me a couple of newspapers. And I would bring the papers in, and then me and these two other guys would write up what's in the paper. The significant thing about this from an innovation point of view is that those would then be published on a wire that was visibly global. And so literally before you could get that on a newsstand in New York City, it was on the Bloomberg. And before anybody, much less in London. And in London, the trading was open. So if it was a global stock or had global implications, they were seeing news summarized on the Bloomberg first. And I think that is like super interesting, right? And it's really would fall into the category of being scrappy and hustling and just figuring out a way to get the client information versus worrying about what information, like the source of it. So old school would be like, well, the journal we want to tell you. Bloomberg's attitude was like, no, the client just wants the information. They don't really care that it's not originally from Bloomberg. It's such a simple thing, but it's an incredibly it was a big innovation at the time, and now it's kind of commonplace, right? People do that everywhere. But it was huge. And so literally the other thing to add there is that the Wall Street Journal owned the competing financial platform, which was called Telerate at the time. The journal's articles would appear on Telerate after 6 or 7 in the morning. So they'd effectively be available on Bloomberg in summary format before they were available on their own platform. And they did that because of, internal internecine warfare of some sort, political warfare of some sort, where the journal folks didn't want their stuff out there, They wanted it in the paper first.
Yeah,
so
they wanted to sell the print copy before
right.
you sell the data on the
Right.
wire.
And I think there are lessons for that for kind of every content company down the line.
Yeah.
Where you're like, no, we want to hold back. We want to hold back to get the whole thing. Actually, we see that online today, even where people are like, well, I have this white paper and I'm going to not tell you what's in the white paper on social. I'll just tell you to click here because I want the click.
Right.
And you're like, okay, but I think that has never been a good strategy historically. And this is a good example of that.
So walk me through more how the career progresses.
So my career started with that summarization and I got my feet wet. And then my boss came to me and said, he says, okay, we want to give you a beat and have you be a reporter, And I can be honest, at the time I was like, I don't want to be a reporter. I like what I'm doing. I like summarizing.
Right. I'm good at this.
I'm good at it. I like it. But anyway, he says, you got to be a reporter. He said, and it was wide open. He says, like, what do you want to cover? And I said, I want to cover Latin America. And that had never occurred to him. He thought that was insane.
Insane in a dumb way or insane in a like, wow, that's fascinating way?
Not particularly fascinating. Sort of like, well, you've got the whole, like he was traditionally, he covered the U.S. corporate bond market. So he's like, I'm probably thought corporate bonds are the greatest thing. But no, it just seemed like very, very niche and like far away. And he said, why? So what I said was that this was 91 or 92. And I said Goldman Sachs had just done the offering for, they had brought public in an IPO, the Mexican telephone company Telmex. And they made $83 million in fees off a $2 billion offering. And I'm like, there's going to be a gold rush. There's all these companies going private, going public, listing, and Wall Street firms are going to go crazy trying to underwrite those deals. And then they're going to recommend investors buy the shares and so forth. So there's going to be a whole ramping up. And I was right about that. and early. So he was like, fine, that sounds good. And so I started writing about it. I wrote about it for about a year. And then there was a lot of demand internally among customers saying, we want more information about Latin America, but we want it, from the countries too. Not just, I was writing about it from a Wall Street finance point of view. And they're like, we want news from Mexico and Brazil and Argentina. And investments were pouring in. And so he said to me, and I think this was kind of a pivotal point for my career, was he said to me, go open offices and hire people there. So I basically had a credit card, and I guess I would have been about 27. And I just opened 7 offices in 7 countries and found people to hire. And I can't say I had any idea what I was doing, and it was totally random. I flew to Mexico City. I looked around. Usually there's like an English language paper, so you read the paper and you figure out who looks good. You find a way to call that person, and then you offer them a job. And that was it. It was like not particularly very well, not a lot of diligence. But everything, this is where, again, it reminds me of startups today, like super fast. Just like find a guy, hire the guy, get going. And many of the people initially worked out of their home. That was their home office, or they worked out of like what was a kind of a WeWork style office. You rented a room, and we got going. But the amazing thing is, like 3 years later, we had 40 people in the region. So that growth went from nobody to 40 people in 7 offices, and at the same time, the rest of the Bloomberg machine kind of kicks in. And so one of the insights I think about Bloomberg that's interesting is he was very early. So news would be kind of like an advanced guard. You'd open an office that produced news out of Mexico. But what that did was make the company visible in that place. Right. So then people wanted to start to buy Bloombergs in Mexico. So then they sent salespeople down. They opened proper offices, and they started to sell in country. But in almost every case, the news person went in first and content led. And I think, we've seen that more recently with companies where the way content makes them visible and recognizable. And, I think Mike was an incredible pioneer in that regard. If you go back to why he started the news operation, he started news because he had a data platform that was profitable, but all you saw were stock, basically charts and prices, descriptions, but there was no way to understand why the stock chart was trending up to the right, And he realized that news was a missing component, text, content, to explain those chart moves. Initially, he bought content from Dow Jones. And then Dow Jones wanted to increase the price and, wasn't happy with Bloomberg's growth. And so he realized he was going to be over a barrel unless he started his own service. And that started. And it's kind of fascinating because, if you look back over 30 years, most people know Bloomberg as a media company, which it's not. It's like a financial information technology that has a media component. But media is the visibility, and it served effectively as a form of advertising for the company's existence, and it served as a form of promotion. So I think all those things tie together with what my experience was in building that group in Latin America, and what came later with lots of business and lots of sales.
So this is still early, moving into the mid 90s. Once there's 40 people,
like 95, 96 in there. Yeah.
Okay, so now the internet's starting. Now, a different awareness of where money is moving is starting to shift yet again. What's the next evolution of the role for you?
So I was, so I did Latin America, and what the next thing that happened to me was that the trends that we saw in Latin America that I identified about privatization, free trade, those spread across the rest of the world, and debt renegotiation. I should add as the third big one. So practically every country in the developing economies was struggling under debt and trade issues. And they all started looking at Mexico's playbook and in Latin America's playbook, and they started to implement the same reforms in Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, and so forth. So,
and isn't it, just for my own brain, but probably for somebody else watching this too, like it's early to mid 90s? When's the big peso crisis?
well, the peso crisis happened in 95.
Okay, I was thinking 94, 95.
I think the first thing that I think about is 1990 was the key year where Mexico renegotiated its
Right.
debt, signed a trade deal, invited foreign investment, and privatized industry.
Yeah, which is
So there was a lag. It took a few years for people to see that, and countries in many other parts of the world started doing the same. So there were hiccups along the way. The most prominent one was the peso devaluation in 95. But I guess I was asked to oversee international emerging markets for Bloomberg. And there was a little bit, so help build out the emerging market coverage in other areas. That was kind of my next role. And then I helped, there were kind of like, I filled a couple of gaps. There was a brief period where me and another guy ran Europe and ran Asia because somebody had left the company and there was like a leadership gap. I don't consider those like major things, except I was just like, it was kind of a little bit of a caretaker situation.
Yeah.
But
you were
it
an
provided
available
some-
hand. There was a need. And
Yeah,
that's
somebody
what-
had to be titularly and responsible at it. The good part about that job was that I traveled a lot to Asia and Europe for several years. And so had, in the mid 90s to late 90s, I was in Europe and Asia a lot. And that was, there's nothing like travel, I think, in terms of career to give you perspective on the rest of the world. It's really important. And then I think by 98, I was made New York bureau chief. So that was kind of a big, it's interesting. I then refocused on U.S. capital markets in a way. My whole career had been on emerging markets, which have very different dynamics than U.S. stocks and bonds and the dollar and so forth. So I did that for like 3 years. And probably the most important aspect of that was I was running the coverage when 9/11 happened. And so I was standing there when the plane hit the tower and we dictated headlines and sort of drove that coverage for that day. And, that was obviously incredibly impactful in memory and impactful. And then after that, I got a promotion to run the Americas. So then I was running New York, the rest of the Americas, Canada, and Latin America. So my job at that point was I wasn't writing, obviously. I was doing still editing, and I was doing managing. And you learn a lot of things about managing people and probably make a lot of mistakes doing that. But it was really, it was quite valuable an experience. So that takes me up to roughly 2005. I had a lateral change to run fixed income globally. These are all in the news operations. So that made me, then I was thinking about fixed income and FX globally. And by that point in 2006, I was, two things happened. I was quite tired and burnt out. I was just...
this is a lot of change, and a lot of change in the wake of...
I think also like Bloomberg's a like particularly intense place, but you're definitely working. You're never not working. You're definitely working 7 days a week, kind of crazy all hours, immense amount of stress, and I felt like I had done everything I was going to do. Like I wasn't going to be editor in chief, and I had hired and fired and built groups and managed teams and dictated coverage and written things. And there wasn't anywhere else I was going to grow there. And at that moment, out of the blue, an opportunity came up to leave editorial and go into a new group, a product team that was being built out. So it was run by a guy named Brian Rooney, who formerly had worked with me in the editorial group. And he said, you're really interested in technology. You need a change. You could help me come run this group and build this out. And it was a complete career. I went for it, and it was a complete career change. I think I also realized a little bit that news and writing were somewhat commodity games in a certain way. Like there wasn't a big differentiator, and I wanted my career to have more depth and learn new things. So to give you a little bit of context, so like, editorial, when you're in editorial, you write or edit and you plan coverage. When you're in product, the idea of a product manager was pretty new still in the early 2000s. It hadn't really been codified the way it is today. But what they realized was that they had salespeople who needed applications. Salespeople were getting intel from clients, and the engineers were building the applications. And they needed somebody to sit between those two roles who could better allocate engineering resources. You could listen to customers and listen to salespeople and understand what the most important products were that were needed to be built. And then you could work with the engineering team to translate those realities into some kind of a roadmap. And I love that because I really love talking to customers. I love talking to salespeople. I needed a change. And there were all these things to build. And so I ended up doing that for 16 years. And lots of great things got built. And it was as if I had a completely different job and career. And I mean, I was still at the same company, but it was effectively not the same company for me. So my career ultimately became 16 years in editorial and 16 years in product. And so I feel like when people ask me, I say, I think about how to create content. I think about how to distribute content, because the product role is really about the distribution of content and information and how people can access it. And it's changed immensely. I mean, just give you one sense. When I started that role, there were about 5,000 stories a day that ran on Bloomberg. And in the not too far after that, there were like 2 million. Okay. So this was a transition from that point, and so we went from the world where it was hard to get information to a world where all the information's there. It's hard to know.
Hard to
where to
sort, filter.
It's about the needle in the haystack. First, it's about the haystack. We don't have any haystacks. And then it's about, oh my God, we have too many haystacks. I think that's really, I think people understand that, but being part of a team that sort of experienced that was really, really interesting. And coming up, then you're just thinking all the time about mechanisms to find the right information. So,
which is a totally different distribution and product set problem that requires the more that comes in. Not the more you have to solve it, but kind of the more you have to figure out new ways to solve it.
Yeah. So it's and I think we're still in that right now.
Oh yeah.
I mean, actually, I think the way I think about that leap in information is I look at it like there's 3 kind of stages. The first stage of my career was the stage where you have professionals producing content, and you have to, and what you really need is more information and more content. The second part is suddenly there's tons of information available, and you have to sort of find the needle, right? And now we're in this next stage where the volumes that we thought were big are now going to be exponentially larger because of the ability to automatically create content through generative AI and others, and because of the emergence of user-generated content to a much greater degree. So before you had, the way you think about it is like when I grew up, we read the New York Times because we were near New York City. So, and we read maybe a local paper for sports. So you read like 2 papers. Then in the 90s and 2000s, you could read any newspaper online, but there were still actual newspapers. And then now where we are is not just are there the traditional newspapers, but there's like any random person has a Substack or a blog or whatever, or Twitter feed. And so you have all these random individuals, plus you have automated content that's just the generative AI stuff. So that's like, it's just exploding. And we're now just drowning in volume, for which the important thing is how do you find the value? And we're very early days in finding that. It's still extremely hard to locate, high quality content and insight. So
I'm curious, like, what did you think? I want to get into this period right up before you get let go. And I'm curious because it comes a couple of years or more than a year after the pandemic starts. Were you starting to feel, how are you feeling about just like the state of the role you were in, the state of the company? I'm not asking you to cast judgment on the company. I'm curious, like what you saw or felt changing again versus when your life got changed by going, oh crap, you need to start something else.
So I think that when I got into product, it was exciting because we were building all these things. We built a bunch of things, and some of them were quite early relative to, the competition of the world. And a good example of that, so this is 2010, was Twitter. I went to a customer in London, and the traders were trading. They had like their phones that they would like prop up to read tweets. And so the hedge fund brought us in and said, can you do something about this? We can't have them trading off their phones. So that led to this whole huge project where we did a deal with Twitter, integrated Twitter into the Bloomberg and so forth. So I had that decade of the 2010s was I thought really interesting and innovative at Bloomberg. And I felt like after the pandemic, there was a lot less innovation, or maybe there was just less innovation in my particular area or division. It was harder to do things. So I'd say like as right before I left, I felt like there was just a lot less we were doing. And this is, I would note it was before generative AI came out. Mm-hmm. And things just felt like they were kind of in the status quo. Like there, for whatever reason there were things we could do or wanted to do, but it definitely had somewhat settled down from compared with the period of 2000, let's say 10 and 2018. So that was my experience, like those years were really innovative. Part of that was due to the fact that Mike Bloomberg returned to the company in 2014, and he returned with a lot of ideas and interest, and he wanted to experience things. And he had a lot of, he wanted to see what was going on. And so we made a lot of changes in those years, 2014 to 2018 or 2019. I think the pandemic, it felt like the pandemic kind of put everybody in a more defensive mode in general. It was more about defense than offense. It's like system reliability, resilience, these kinds of it's like, okay, make sure it's fast, it doesn't break, as opposed to sort of the innovation. And I think that might have been even sort of generally across the board. That's not just a Bloomberg thing. So
certainly for any established business, defense.
Established businesses, yeah. So I think, I left Bloomberg in 2022. Generative AI came out in 2020, at the end of 2022. And that changed, then the landscape changed dramatically, right? Everything got kind of like put the pedal down, I would say. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
it answers it enough because it sets up this part of it. So you find yourself on the other side of Bloomberg, and I know this is kind of where we opened up too. And one would think you've got 32 years or whatever it is of network and connections and global tie-ins to everything from capital markets to news to products. But what did you think was going to happen, or where did you start to try to do first when you land on the outside?
So when I left Bloomberg, I initially thought I would join or look to try and get on with a tech company and have a similar product manager role and help perhaps them guide this, towards, financial markets and so forth in some way. And two things changed my mind. The first was that a friend of mine, Howard Lindzon, who's a venture capitalist, I had lunch with him right after I left the company, and he invited me to his annual meeting with LPs and portfolio companies, and it's in Scottsdale. And I went, and so I spent 4 days listening to startup pitches. And I had never really been involved in the startup or angel world or the VC world whatsoever. My focus had always been on bulge bracket financial firms. So I found the energy in this world incredible. I found the passion, the interest, the open sharing of information. I found a fair amount of interest in my background at Bloomberg and how Bloomberg had accomplished things. And I was just like, okay, this is a great environment. I want to be more involved in this environment. And that was the first thing. And the second thing was that, when you're kind of cast out of a company you've been in a long time and you don't have a network, you're looking around. And I spent a lot of time doom scrolling on the internet and on Twitter in particular. And there were all these meetups and events advertised by people, like breakfasts for startups and founders and different things, right? And I just started going to a bunch of them. And most of them were organized by people in their 20s, early 30s. And it was a completely different energy. And you had asked me earlier about to contrast that with the energy of Bloomberg when I left. And I was like, wow, there's so much more energy here than in my previous job. And it was at that point I thought, okay, I'm not going to, instead of trying to look for a product manager job at a large corporation where I'm once again in a similar role, I want to try to do something different. And so that's where that idea was, just meeting a lot of young people starting companies. I think really gave me insight into the entrepreneurial energy, and hanging out with more VCs, startups, and so forth. I really changed my perspective on what would be a good thing to do with your time and how you could spend your time. And I think lastly, I would say, again, I felt the world had changed where it was clear that if you were over a certain age, it was going to be hard to find a job that had any stability, and your probability of getting fired again were pretty high. And I think the better, ironically, the safer bet was not to look for a job, but to try to create your own company and create something, because you can work as hard as you want on that and you can build something there. So I think those three things were my calculations. And I think what happened to me after that was very organic. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I started writing a lot of content on LinkedIn. There wasn't any particular goal there, except that I wanted to express myself. I could, for the first time ever, write about things I was seeing. And I experienced personally this thing where when you create content, the world kind of discovers you. And so if you put out your ideas and you put out your thoughts, people with similar interests and observations reach out to you. And in my case, a number of them said, hey, can we jump on a call? I want to talk about what you wrote about. And some of them said, we'd love to hire you, because when you write things, people seem to be really engaged, and you get a lot of comments and engagement. And when we write things, we don't get as much engagement. You do a consulting project with us and help us explain how to do this. And then some of those projects led to engagements where they said, can you just help write this for us? Because we want to be visible in online writing, but we don't know how to do it, clearly. So quite organically, I then had to start a company to do that, because I needed a tax ID. And next thing I know, I was making some money. I wasn't making a lot of money, but I was making some money. And I was like, couldn't believe people would pay me for this. And I just became very focused on it. And that's how my my ghostwriting agency, Principles Media, came about. It just seemed like there was a demand, there's a need. And the more I read about it and the more I looked at it, the more convinced I became of something else I had not seen previously, which was this structural shift in the world from where companies and individuals relied on the media to tell their story, and they would hire PR agencies to try to get the media coverage, to a new world where people would tell their own story. And by telling the story, they would connect directly with, investors or stakeholders or employees or whomever. And those pieces all fell into place. And then I went back and I saw a lot of the steps that got us here, and I could see that. But I had not really understood the dynamics of that before. And now it's kind of the only thing I think about, which is how that, and it's, I see it everywhere. It's, we're talking at the time, there was just a big announcement about the federal government, or Trump was kind of investigating Jerome Powell at the Fed. And let's look at how Jerome Powell responded. Jerome Powell put out his own video talking about it. Jerome Powell did not call the New York Times and say, please write a piece defending me. I think we're so early in this trend. And I think that so many people, some people are good at this, and some people do it naturally, but there's so many people who struggle. They struggle to tell their own story. They struggle to know how to get online. And so I think there's a big role for, people like myself, helping other people tell their stories and helping other people do that. And I think we're just very early innings of this. And I think it's very dramatic because it's such a secular trend in communications. It's like, I don't think people really understand how dramatic this is, where you have the pipeline to reach the world. You can reach the world. So
it's so much flatter. And back to that user-generated content point almost before in the exponential growth curve, it's still 1% of the people making 99% of the stuff.
Right. And I had an experience. I'll tell you, a couple of things cemented this for me. One was that when I left Bloomberg, I met up with a woman named Louise Story for lunch, and she was formerly of the Wall Street Journal. And she told me, she asked me what I did at Bloomberg, and I told her the projects I did. And she said, wow, that's amazing. You did a lot of incredible stuff. And she says, how come I've never heard of you? And I said, well, I don't want to brag about it, and I don't want to, that seems like, it was kind of one of those, well, it's about the team and everybody and whatever. And she said to me, if you don't tell your story, no one else will. And that really stuck in my mind, because I think it's not, I think we're shifting into a world where we used to rely on companies or other people to acknowledge what we've done. And it just doesn't work that way. You have to tell the world who you are and what you're doing. And you have the capability now. Before that didn't exist. But in the last 10 years, it has really been in place. And so it's kind of up to you to tell your story and to let people know what you're doing, what you want to do, so they can find you. It's a fundamental change. We used to look for jobs in a kind of targeted way. And I think, that's not working very well right now. What's working better is people say, okay, this is the things I do, this is who I am, and people can find you. And I think that's such a radical change that, again, people are still getting their arms around how that works.
I took a couple notes. I want to take you back through some things that you said in this conversation. And I'm jumping straight into the top of these notes because of what you were just saying, which is the difference in the value of community versus networking or a network. And I'm curious, I felt intentionality behind those two words. Differentiate between community and network and how you think about them.
So I think there's a difference between community and networking. Networking was what I experienced when I was a reporter. And I would say, let's say I was writing a story about a particular thing that happened at Goldman Sachs, I would want to find the person to talk to, call them, have lunch with them, and try to persuade them to tell me. It was a rifle shot. There's I went right to that person. And that was the way we approached many things. You wanted a job, you tried to call the hiring person at that company. Okay? So many things in life where you wanted a date, you tried to hire, you went right to that woman, And I think what we see now in community is quite different. People are more generally trying to get connected and meet people with less of a ask or anything transactional and more of an intentionality of let me meet and share what I'm working on, who I am and what I do. And maybe there's some intersection here. But a fundamental difference is 10, 20 years ago, when I called or tried to meet with someone, it was because I had a specific thing I wanted to get done or a specific ask. The people I meet with these days, and I would say I meet with someone new almost every day. Those meetings are almost never have a specific goal. I mean, there's some reason why I'm talking to them. We have some interest in common or something. But it's not okay, at the end of this call, I'm selling you the pen or you're selling me the pen or I'm buying the pen or anything. It's just, we're going to meet up and we're going to share perspective and ideas and discover if we've got common ground for a deeper conversation. But by the way, in the process of that, you are actually expanding the group of people in the community who are aware of you and know about what you're up to. And those meetings oftentimes lead to engagements or business or friendships or something, that you weren't ever pursuing. So that to me is the real difference. Networking is going after a very specific person and goal, and building community is much more I suspect that we've got some common ground here. So let's pursue that. But it may come back later, what we may or may not end up working together and so forth. I think it's so different, and it's generational, I think. And I think, the younger Gen Z particularly this is how they operate, I'm struck by, I don't know if everybody's aware of this, but if you think about how a company or an older group of people would organize an event, so they would say, okay, let's make a list of our customers or people who are going to pay us in some way, and we're going to invite them. And it's going to be, you get the invitation or you don't, And so the way younger people do this is they post things on Twitter and they say, I'm having a dinner for 12 people. DM me if you want in. So the idea of putting that on the internet for an older generation is inconceivable, I think. Inconceivable. You would never see Goldman Sachs put out a post that says, hey, we're going to have a dinner for some investors. DM us if you want to come. They would not do that. They would curate the list this way. But there's some different things that happen when you put it out. Why don't they do it publicly? Because they think, oh, someone will be mad if they don't get invited or they don't get included or whatever. They're afraid of they want to control it. And the younger version is less of a controlling dynamic. And it's much more open and public, and it has a lot of aspects of social media in general. It's more democratic in a way. You have a shot of getting in, but it's still curated. It's not like anyone can come. Somebody still makes a selection. It's very interesting. So I think we're moving towards that second scenario, right? Where more of our interactions are open. It allows for sort of a more global reach too, which is interesting. You more serendipity of discovering people who might answer that you would never been on your list. It changes a lot of the dynamics.
It's interesting because within a lot of aspects of that too, it's what emphasis or where do you put the bottleneck? Where do you put the bottleneck that this determines what's valuable on the other side? And confusion, disagreement, or opportunity by where you set just a bottleneck on the same problem, an investor dinner.
Yeah.
Can lead to wildly different outcomes with just who's willing to set what where.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. The community and network is interesting. People don't like networking has a kind of negative feel to it these days, I think.
Yeah.
Community has a more positive feel, but I don't think that's I think there's a fundamental difference in the way people are going about it. I do. And I think it's somewhat generational. Or maybe it's not entirely generational, but I would say that I find people who are online chronically understand the community part better than people who are not chronically online.
All right. That gives me my next question, which I have to also just, not as solidarity alone, but partially as solidarity. I had a similar poached egg moment in Germany. When you told that story, I remember the egg in the little cup holder thing and being like, I've never seen this before in my
I've never
life.
seen this before. What is that?
Why are you presenting an egg to me in this weird little stand? Where does this stand come from? Why is it here? What's happening?
Yeah.
Okay. So the relationship between immersion and imitation, I feel like imitation when you're immersed is different from imitation when you're not immersed. And there's an interesting connection here. And I wrote it in the margins. What do you think that is?
Say more about what you mean by that. What's within what area or what area, how you think?
I think imitation, especially like mimetic things, like when we are extremely focused, which immersion is something really good at doing, then we can start to see those patterns and catch on. But if we're just on the outside, if we're not immersed, it can be really hard to like spot all the context clues of imitation. And maybe I would go so far as to tie this to an older generation planning a meetup differently than a younger generation. Like, it's just like, if you're not immersed, how would you know? What's that? It feels like a skill too, that you've been cultivating because of several immersive experiences core to your identity.
Yeah, it's a question. That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think that I don't know if I have anything profound to say about that, except that I would say when I went to a bunch of meetups for young founders, or just not young, but founders who were younger than me, you can tell other people about that, but unless you've been there, you can't really understand the feeling of it, you know? And so maybe that speaks to immersion, but it's like, I think you do have to, I think you have to put yourself in situations to understand, and I think that's something I look at now as very important. I didn't realize how important that is to be in environments and so forth. I think that's something I underinvested in my career. And I'd encourage, like, if you were starting out in your career, try to think about that. Like, where are the environments or the places? Have you been in them? Do you know them? Can you get into them? Can you get in it's a sort of metaphorical room. Have you been in the room, you know? Is what people would say. And so I think it's more important than I realized to try to make that happen.
Is that part of...
I would just say I had that experience last year, and you and I talked about it, where I went to Buffett's annual meeting, the Berkshire meeting in Omaha.
Yeah.
And so I've been thinking about the Omaha meeting since 1995. And I was, at some point in the 90s, the person who assigned the Bloomberg reporters to going. So different people would want to go, and I'd be like, I'd decide who goes. And so I understood it was an important thing, right? I understood it was a big deal, but I never myself got on the plane and went until last year. And so last year was his last year. That was the last one. And so I'm glad I did it, but I was like, wow, what a giant mistake. Like, I knew that was a big deal. And when you're there, you meet people and have experiences you can't have if you don't go. And if you're in that business and in that arena, you want to be there. So I thought that was, to me, it's like, wow, okay, that was a big lesson, you know.
Is the cycle of going out and meeting new people, like, obviously you have breakfast with somebody and you just take the opportunity to meet a new person with no set agenda. That's very different from going to a Berkshire annual meeting. But at the same time, there's,
I think it's a similar
I
dynamic.
think so too. Why do you think so?
I think it's the same dynamic. It's like, do you prioritize getting out and meeting people and having experiences and being in a place? And I think you compared it, what did you call it? Imitation versus immersion?
Yeah.
I think of it more of the trade-off between efficiency and so my version of that is efficiency versus effective, efficient versus effective. Okay, so it is more efficient to stay in the office and talk to the person on the phone. But it is more effective to get on the subway and go and meet them for the same. So there's a little bit more time to get there and get back. It's more effective to meet them in person, but not more efficient. And I think the mistake people make oftentimes in their career, and I made, was prioritizing efficiency for effectiveness. So I didn't get on the plane and go to Omaha, and that was efficient because I could just read about it, but it was not effective. It would have been way more effective to go.
All right, I have one more very pointed one out of the Bloomberg story, and just the way that you set this up. And I'm curious if this is a bigger metaphor, or maybe it's not. You talked about having like the chart. So here's the chart of oil going this way or that way or whatever.
Yeah.
And then realizing, layering in context, layering in story, layering in content, paired with this visual, explaining the visual, made it 5, 10, a million times more powerful.
Yeah.
And then just taking that across all the different like pictures, things to explain, whatever else. There's something about merging those two worlds, like something visual and something written, and making them happen together. And I feel like we're constantly iterating on that.
It's interesting. Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think okay. So from my career point of view, I think that what is underestimated by the world is the value and importance of that explanation to things that people experience and see. So I think it goes much bigger than what you're even saying. So I could show you a chart of anything. And in finance, we're all good at looking at charts. But then, and you could probably say, oh, that's a chart of, I don't know, percentage of Americans who read at a 6th grade level or whatever it is. It could be anything. And you're going to draw a conclusion from that. But then the value of explaining the chart with the framing, contextual understanding and explanation, incredibly value. And that's true even when we're looking at like a video, a chart, or even reading text. So you can read lots of things, and then it's the explanation of them, which helps, which influences how you understand it, is what I'd say better than just. One of the fascinating things about the internet these days, and it's not something which you would necessarily have predicted, is the enormous amount of explanatory content. And I do this myself. I literally will, like I've been doing all these videos online where I talk about something that happened and then I explain it. I give you my take on that. So I think it's a similar kind of thing, the origin of what Bloomberg was trying to do, adding news to charts to explain the why. You have the what and you need to explain the why. And you see this on the internet all day long now. Like, so people are like, they say this happened and here's how you should be thinking about it, or here's how I think about it. It's really quite interesting. I guess it comes from a very fundamental place where people want to explain their point of view, and other people want to hear, how should I understand this thing I'm experiencing? And sometimes we're looking at the same thing and we have different explanations for it. That happens as well, right? Yeah, I think that's quite interesting.
I think
that never gets tired. Like it never gets old. Like that, there's a need for that. There's an endless need for that. So, yeah, it's interesting.
And there's something about how that function sort of naturally evolves alongside communities and networks, because who we know, who we're in community with, especially in the modern era, I feel like it changes a lot. It's not like, take it back to your dad for a second. Like your dad in the town and in the community where he had the job, where he, raised you, coached the sports teams, like that wasn't the most porous community. Like, sure, some people were coming in and some people were coming out over time. But this is a different world for how things get curated because of sort of how porous all of our communities and networking functions can be. Is that part of what makes it different now than then?
I don't think so. I think what's different about the world now is that the technology has scaled the community. And I think that's the fundamental difference. So when I grew up, I was in my town and I knew people in my town and I read the newspaper that was in my town and I talked to people in my town. And I didn't know anybody in the next town. And then, and we've had these evolutions now where, I think a better way to think about it, I think technology then goes back to the example where when you grew up, you read one newspaper, and then technology with the internet allowed you to read multiple newspapers online. And then it allowed you to read viewpoints from people who weren't even at a newspaper, who were just random people online. And now we're getting to the point where with automatic translation, you can read any newspaper in the world in any language, and it's immediately in your own language. So I think that's what the technology has done is scaled your ability to consume from wider. We've gone from geography used to be the limiting factor, right? And we have eliminated first we eliminated the barrier of geography by language, but now we're eliminating the language and so forth. So I think I think that's what it is, and so we're still coming to terms with that. It's confusing. Yeah. It's confusing because you suddenly. I think maybe a lot of the scope of conflict in the world too is like you're suddenly put up against lots of points of view and different cultures and different things that you hadn't really experienced and would not have experienced before. And so that's confusing to know how to adapt to that or respond to that. But it's not going back, so that's for sure.
That is for sure. Ted, I needed to get all this background from you, so I'm really grateful you're willing to spend this much time.
This was crazy. I've never done an interview like this, so there you go.
Well, good. I needed to be one to get this one on record from you with all these stories. And special shout out here too. Like you did a great talk with Bogomil on Talking Billions. Certainly the Howard Lindsons of the world. I'm pretty sure Howard's the reason we got to meet and ties back somewhere through that network of people. So this is testament to the way these things all wrap around and these stories get intermingled and focused. If people want to learn more, if they want to check out Principles Media, if they want to connect with you on LinkedIn, where should we send them to look you up?
So LinkedIn is probably the best, easiest place to find me. I'm pretty visible and I post often, and they can connect with me there or DM me there. I have a newsletter they can follow. That's surface area, and I'm sometimes on Twitter. I'll probably do more there soon. So,
all right. Well, this is my word of encouragement: connect, follow, trade comments back and forth with Ted on the internet. He's a great person to know, and because he keeps meeting so many new people, I mean, it's just you're feeding me crack here. I'm just like, oh, Ted's gonna meet 7 to 12 new people this week. Who is he going to introduce me to next? It's a pure joy. Ted, you're a truly intentional investor. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for being here, Matt.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe wherever you're watching The Intentional Investor so more people can find our show. You can follow Matt directly at cultishcreative.com or at cultishcreative on Twitter. For more great content at the intersection of investing and life, check out epsilontheory.com or at epsilontheory on Twitter.